That woman over there, she used to be my wife. Now she's just a mistake I haven't finished correcting." Grant Sterling said it into a live microphone, laughing, while 200 people watched Vivian stand 30 feet away holding a champagne glass she never let fall. Then he turned, kissed Camille on the mouth, and walked her to the table marked Mrs. Sterling, like Vivian was furniture he'd already sold. That night, he offered her $10 million to vanish quietly. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just smiled, and that smile should have destroyed him on the spot, because Vivian Sterling wasn't just his wife, she was Vivian Ashbourne, and he had absolutely no idea what that name was about to cost him. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens to Grant Sterling is not. The Meridian Grand Hotel in Manhattan had seen 1,000 powerful men walk through its gilded doors. Senators, tech billionaires, hedge fund kings who wore their arrogance like a second tuxedo. But on the night of April 14th, the man who walked in with the most confidence, the man who owned the room before he even crossed the threshold, was Grant Sterling. 47 years old, 6'2", the kind of jaw that photographers loved and rivals feared. CEO of Sterling Vector, a logistics and AI infrastructure company valued at $9 billion and climbing. He had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times. He had shaken hands with presidents. He had spoken at Davos about the future of global supply chains, as if he personally invented the concept of moving things from one place to another. And tonight he had decided was the night he stopped pretending. He walked into the Meridian Grand with Camille Laurent on his arm. Camille was 34, French-born, Columbia-educated, razor-sharp in a boardroom, and twice as dangerous in a social setting. She was his CFO. She had been his CFO for 4 years. And for the last 2 of those 4 years, she had been something considerably more personal. She wore a black gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her hair was pulled back in that effortless way that took 3 hours to achieve. She laughed at something Grant whispered to her as they entered, and the sound of that laugh, easy, intimate, practiced, cut through the ambient music like a blade. Vivian Sterling was already inside. She had arrived 40 minutes early as she always did. Quiet habit. Old instinct. She believed that showing up early to an event meant you got to watch people arrive, and watching people arrive told you everything about who they actually were when they thought no one important was looking. She stood near the far end of the room in a midnight blue gown. Simple, elegant, the kind of dress that didn't need jewelry to make a statement. Her dark hair was down, falling past her shoulders. She was 43 years old, and she looked like a woman who had been through something not broken by it, but shaped by it in the way that marble gets shaped when a sculptor knows exactly what he's doing. She saw Grant the moment he walked in. She saw Camille. She saw the way Grant's hand rested on the small of Camille's back, proprietary, casual, completely unbothered by the presence of 200 guests who all knew on some level exactly what they were looking at. Vivian did not move. She raised her champagne glass slightly, took a slow sip, and her expression did not change by a single degree. That was the first thing people noticed later when they tried to piece together the sequence of events. Not that Grant had humiliated her, not that Camille had smiled through it, but that Vivian Sterling, who had been his wife for 11 years, had watched her husband walk in with another woman and shown absolutely nothing on her face. Eleanor Marsh, Vivian's closest friend, and the only person who knew more about Vivian than Vivian usually allowed, was standing 2 steps behind her. Eleanor was a former federal judge now in her early 60s, with silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades making people tell the truth in rooms they would rather leave. She leaned forward slightly. "He actually brought her," Eleanor said under her breath, "to this, tonight, with you standing here." "Yes," Vivian said. "Are you going to—" "No." "Vivian, Eleanor." The word was calm, steady, final. "I know." Eleanor studied her friend's face for a long moment. Whatever she found there made her go quiet. She took a sip of her own champagne and said nothing more. Grant made his way through the room with the ease of a man who had never once worried that a room wouldn't receive him well. He shook hands. He laughed at appropriate moments. He made 2 or 3 comments that were sharp enough to make other powerful men feel slightly less powerful, which was for Grant the point of almost every social interaction he had. He did not approach Vivian. He did not acknowledge her with even a glance. At 7:45, the event coordinator, a nervous young woman named Dana, who had clearly not been briefed on the full scope of what was about to happen, approached the Sterling table to confirm the seating arrangement. The table near the center of the room, the one reserved for the gala's primary sponsor, had 2 seats marked with small gold-lettered cards. One read Mr. Grant Sterling, the other read Mrs. Sterling. Dana confirmed the arrangement with the head of Grant's PR team, a man named Todd, who smiled tightly and said, "There's been a slight change to the seating." He removed the card marked Mrs. Sterling. He placed a new card. The new card read, Ms. Camille Laurent. Dana looked at the card. She looked at Todd. She looked across the room at Vivian Sterling, who was standing not 30 feet away. Is there a second table for—" "Mrs. Sterling is being moved to table 12, Todd said flatly. "Near the back. There was a request." Dana opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the card one more time. Then she picked up the small numbered placard for table 12 and walked across the room toward Vivian Sterling with the specific expression of someone who would very much like to have chosen a different career. Eleanor saw her coming and stepped slightly forward. "Miss Sterling," Dana said carefully because she had clearly decided not to say Mrs. in case it made everything worse. "There's been a small adjustment to the seating for this evening. You've been moved to table 12. I'm so sorry for any—" "Thank you," Vivian said. "Just that. 2 words. Thank you." Dana blinked. She had apparently braced for something entirely different. Of course. The table is just—" "I know where table 12 is," Vivian said, and smiled at her with something that was entirely genuine and entirely unreadable. "You didn't do anything wrong. Thank you for telling me." Dana walked away looking like she'd survived something she didn't fully understand. Vivian didn't move toward table 12. She stayed where she was. She watched as Grant and Camille settled into the center table as Camille picked up the card with her own name on it and laughed softly at something Grant said about it, and Vivian's expression remained exactly what it had been for the last 20 minutes. Still, watchful, present. It was Thomas Whitfield, a hedge fund manager who had known Grant for 15 years and Vivian for almost as long, who finally walked over. Thomas was 61, built like a man who used to play rugby and still thought about it with the kind of old money discomfort at public scenes that makes men like him walk toward a problem rather than away from it. "Vivian," he said quietly, "this is—" He stopped, tried again. "I don't have words for what this is. He's lost his mind. I want you to know that everyone in this room who matters can see exactly what's happening." "I know," Vivian said. "If you want to leave, I can have a car." "Thomas." She touched his arm briefly. "I'm not leaving. You're going to sit at table 12. She looked at him. And something moved behind her eyes then, something deep and old and very, very certain. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not going to do that either." Thomas Whitfield stared at her. "Then what are you going to do?" Vivian looked across the room at her husband, who was laughing now loudly at something Camille had said, and she said almost to herself, "I'm going to remember everything." She put her champagne glass down on the nearest surface, straightened her gown, and walked not to table 12 and not to the exit, but to a small quiet alcove near the far wall, where she took out her phone and made a single phone call that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. No one at the party knew who she called. No one would understand why it mattered until weeks later. Grant gave his speech at 8:15. He was good at speeches. He always had been. He talked about Sterling Vector's new AI logistics framework. He talked about disrupting global supply chains. He made 3 jokes that landed well. He thanked the extraordinary team at Sterling Vector and looked at Camille when he said extraordinary. He did not mention his wife. Not once. Not by implication, not even in the practiced vague way that powerful men sometimes reference their personal lives at public events. Vivian Sterling, who had attended 46 events like this one over 11 years, who had sat through every difficult early year, every failed deal, every moment when the company was more debt than asset, did not exist in his speech. The applause that followed was long and warm. Vivian stood in the alcove and watched. At 9 o'clock, Grant found her. He walked across the room with the particular energy of a man who has decided to have an unpleasant conversation and wants to get it over with efficiently. He stopped 2 feet from her, hands in his pockets, and looked at her the way a person looks at something they're about to throw away, not with hatred exactly, but with a kind of decisive indifference that is in some ways worse. "You should go home," he said. "I'm fine where I am," Vivian said. "This isn't the time or the place, Vivian." "I agree with you completely. I haven't made it either." He looked at her steadily. "I'm having my lawyers call you in the morning." She said nothing. "I think we both know where this is going," he said. "I'd rather do it cleanly, quickly. I'm prepared to be more than fair." "Are you?" $10 million, he said. "That's the number. Clean break, no public proceedings, no ugliness. You sign what needs to be signed and you go and you—" He paused. "You start over. You'll be fine. You've always been resourceful." The word resourceful landed in the air between them. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. The party continued around them, voices, music, the soft percussion of heels on marble. The world kept moving in that specific way it does when something privately enormous is happening at its edges. "Grant," she said, and her voice was so even, so completely without tremor or heat, that it made him still. "How long have you believed that I have no options?" He frowned slightly. "What? How long?" she said again with careful patience, as if she were explaining something to someone who would understand it only much later. "Have you been operating under the assumption that I would have nowhere to go if you decided to throw me away?" "That's not what this is, because I'm curious," she said, "whether it happened gradually or if you always thought it. Whether the first year of our marriage you were already calculating what I was worth and what I wasn't. Whether you looked at me at the beginning and thought, she needs this, she needs me, she has nothing of her own. I'd really like to know." Grant's jaw tightened. "This is not the conversation I came over here to have." "No," Vivian agreed, "but it's the one we're having." She looked past him briefly toward the center table where Camille was speaking to an elderly board member with practiced charm. Then she looked back at her husband. "Enjoy your evening," she said. "I'll have Eleanor take me home." She moved to walk past him. He caught her arm, not hard, not aggressive, but certain, the grip of a man accustomed to stopping things from moving away from him. "10 million, Vivian," he said, low and direct. "That's a real number. Don't let pride make you stupid." She looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at his face. "Let go," she said. He let go. She walked toward Eleanor, who had been watching from across the room, with an expression that was all old judge composure on the surface and something considerably colder underneath. "Ready?" Eleanor asked. "Almost," Vivian said. She stopped, stood perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back and looked at the room one last time, at the lights and the people and the center table and Camille and the name card that used to say Mrs. Sterling, and she absorbed all of it with the specific attention of someone who is building a complete and accurate record. "Now I'm ready," she said. In the car on the way home, Eleanor finally asked, "What was that call you made earlier? The one in the alcove?" Vivian looked out the window at the passing city. "I called my brother," she said. Eleanor waited. "He's been asking me for 2 years if I was ready," Vivian said. "Tonight I told him yes." "Ready for what?" Eleanor asked. Vivian turned from the window, and in the dark interior of the car with Manhattan sliding past the glass like a river of light, she said something that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. "To come home," Vivian said. In the 11 years of their marriage, Grant Sterling had learned 3 things about his wife. First, she was quiet in crowds but loud in private, and the things she said in private were almost always worth listening to. Second, she had no family that he knew of some vague reference to a European background, a father who died young money that had run out before she ever came to New York. Third, she loved him, or had loved him, in that deep and self-contained way that some women love men who are too busy to notice it until it stops. He had never asked about the name, the full name, the name on her original documents when they married, which his attorneys had processed and filed, and never flagged, Because why would they? Why would any of that matter? Vivian Ashbourne Sterling. He had seen it. He had never thought about it. That night, while Grant was still at the gala and Camille was laughing in the seat that used to say, Mrs. Sterling, Vivian sat at the desk in the study of the apartment she had lived in for 9 years and opened a laptop that Grant had never seen. It was not connected to any network he recognized. It had no history on its browser. It had been waiting for a specific moment for longer than Grant had run his company. She pulled up a file, read through it with the focused attention of someone reviewing not new information, but information they have already memorized and are now reading simply as confirmation. Then she opened a message thread, typed 4 words, begin the review protocol, sent it, closed the laptop, got up, made herself a cup of tea, sat by the window and watched the city the way she had watched it for 11 years, patiently, completely, with the full knowledge that the city was not going anywhere and neither was she. The message was received by 17 people in 6 countries within the hour. Not one of them worked for Grant Sterling. Every single one of them worked for her. Grant came home at midnight. He did not look for her. He went directly to the guest room which had become his room 3 months ago, and which they had both pretended in the efficient, silent way of a failing marriage to not notice. In the morning, everything would begin. He did not know that. She did. And in the quiet dark of a Manhattan night, Vivian Ashbourne Sterling drank her tea and waited for the world to show her husband what he had never thought to look for, the foundation beneath the foundation he'd built his empire on. It had always been there. He had just never asked whose name was on it. The morning after the gala, Grant Sterling woke up at 6:45 with the specific clarity of a man who has made a decision and intends to execute it before doubt has the chance to schedule a meeting. He showered, put on his gray suit, drank his coffee standing at the kitchen counter the way he always did when he was preparing for something he considered a formality. Then he called his lead attorney, Marcus Hale, and told him to have the paperwork ready by noon. The full package, Marcus asked. The full package, Grant said. 10 million, clean NDA, no contested assets. She takes what's in her personal account and whatever's in the apartment that belonged to her before the marriage. Everything else stays. There was a brief pause on the line. Marcus Hale had been Grant's attorney for 9 years. He was careful, the way old dogs are careful, not timid, just experienced enough to know when something might bite. Grant, have you had your team do a full asset review on her side? Before we go in, standard procedure is to... Marcus, Grant set down his coffee cup. She doesn't have a side. That's the point. Draw up the papers. Marcus drew up the papers. At 11:15, Vivian received a call from Eleanor, who had already heard through the specific underground telegraph of New York legal circles that Grant's attorneys had filed for an expedited private dissolution meeting. Eleanor's voice on the phone was controlled but tight in the way that controlled voices get when the person speaking them is working hard to stay that way. He's moving fast, Eleanor said. The meeting is set for Thursday, 2 days. I know, Vivian said. Your own attorneys need to be briefed, the full briefing, Vivian, not the version you've been giving them. I've already called Jonathan, Vivian said. A silence on the line, then Jonathan Graves. Yes. Another silence, longer this time. Eleanor exhaled. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, not softer exactly, but recalibrated the way a person recalibrates when they realize the situation they thought they understood is actually several sizes larger than they estimated. You've had Jonathan Graves on standby this whole time. For about 3 years, yes, Vivian said. Vivian, Eleanor's voice was almost a whisper. How long have you been planning this? Vivian looked out the window at the city below. The city that did not sleep, the city that moved at the speed of ambition, the city where Grant Sterling had built his empire on supply chains and algorithms, and the absolute certainty that he was the most important person in any room he entered. I didn't plan it, Vivian said carefully. I prepared for it. There's a difference. Planning means you intend for something to happen. Preparing means you're ready if it does. And now it has. And now it has, Vivian agreed. She ended the call, sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap. Then she picked up a different phone, not the one she used for everyday calls, but the one that had been sitting in the drawer of her desk, like a key waiting for a lock to appear, and she dialed Jonathan Graves. Jonathan Graves was 68 years old, originally from Charleston, with the slow, deliberate speech of a man who had learned early that the person who talks fastest in a legal proceeding usually loses it. He had spent 40 years as one of the most quietly powerful estate and corporate attorneys in the world, not the kind of powerful that ends up on magazine covers, but the kind that ends up in rooms where the real decisions get made and never reported. He had worked for the Ashbourne family for over 2 decades, and he had been waiting for this specific call with the patient readiness of someone who has already laid every groundwork there is to lay. "Thursday," Vivian said when he picked up. "I heard," Jonathan said. "I've been watching their filing movement since 6 this morning. Marcus Hale is thorough, but he's working blind. He has no idea what he's walking into." "What do we bring Thursday?" "What we've always planned to bring," Jonathan said. "But I want you to understand something, Vivian. Once we open this, there is no version of Thursday where Grant Sterling leaves that room the same man who walked into it. You understand that?" "Yes." "And you're ready for that?" She didn't answer immediately. Because Jonathan Graves, who had known her for a long time, deserved an honest answer rather than a fast one. She thought about 11 years. She thought about Table 12. She thought about the way Grant had held her arm at the gala, certain proprietary, the grip of a man who believed that things stayed where he put them. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." "Then I'll see you Thursday," Jonathan said. "And Vivian, wear something simple, not a statement, something that says you walked in because you had to, not because you wanted to win." "I know how to dress for a room," she said. "I know you do," he said. And there was something in his voice, then a warmth that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with the fact that Jonathan Graves had watched this woman navigate an 11-year situation that would have broken most people in 11 months. "I'll see you Thursday." Thursday morning arrived the way important mornings always do, ordinary on its surface, charged underneath the kind of morning that looks like all the others until you're standing inside it, and you realize the air has a different quality than yesterday. Grant arrived at the private meeting suite in the offices of Hale and Associates at 9:58, 2 minutes early, which was Grant's way of demonstrating control. He wore his charcoal suit, no tie, the studied casual authority of a man who doesn't need a tie to be taken seriously. Camille was with him, which was not standard practice for a dissolution meeting, and which Marcus had quietly suggested against. Grant had overruled him. "She's my CFO," Grant had said. "She's also my future. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to manage anyone's feelings." Camille sat to Grant's left, the slim portfolio she'd brought more prop than substance, her expression carrying the particular composure of someone who has convinced herself that being present in a situation you have no business being in is actually a display of strength. Marcus Hale sat to Grant's right, his own materials organized with the neat compulsiveness of a man who controls anxiety through order. 3 associates flanked him. Vivian arrived at 10:01. She walked in alone. That was the first thing. No entourage, no visible support team, just Vivian in a cream-colored jacket and dark trousers, hair pulled back, simply the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself but somehow fills whatever room it enters. She looked at Grant when she came in, looked at Camille beside him, and the expression on her face was the same expression she had worn at the gala. Not cold, not hurt, but watchful, and settled in a way that made the temperature of the room feel slightly different than it had before she walked in. Behind her, one person followed. Jonathan Graves. Marcus Hale looked up from his papers. He recognized Jonathan immediately. Any attorney operating at that level would have, and something shifted in his posture, barely perceptible, the kind of micro-adjustment that happens when a person recalculates the nature of what's in front of them. Grant did not recognize Jonathan Graves. He looked at the older man, the way he looked at most people he didn't immediately categorize with a brief automatic assessment that concluded attorney old school, probably brought in to make this look more serious than it is. He looked back at Vivian. "You could have brought a team," he said, and it was almost genial, the graciousness of a man who believes he has already won and can therefore afford to be pleasant. "We're not here to make this difficult." "I know," Vivian said. She sat down across from him. Jonathan Graves sat beside her with the unhurried ease of someone settling into a chair they've sat in 1,000 times before. "Shall we begin?" Marcus opened with his terms. He presented them clearly and professionally. The $10 million settlement, the NDA, provisions the asset division, the timeline for the dissolution. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, his language careful and precise, the language of a man who has practiced this particular presentation more than once and believes it is airtight. When he finished, the room was quiet. Grant looked at Vivian. Questions. 1, Vivian said. She did not look at her own notes. She did not look at Jonathan. She looked directly at her husband. The NDA clause in Section 4, the one that prohibits any public statement related to the marriage, its circumstances, or the dissolution proceedings. Does that include financial disclosures to relevant regulatory bodies? Marcus blinked. It was a very small blink, barely visible, but Grant caught it because he was watching Marcus and not Vivian. That clause is standard. Does it include financial disclosures to relevant regulatory bodies? Vivian said again, with the same calm patience she had used at the gala when Grant told her to go home. Same register, same steadiness, the tone of someone who already knows the answer and is asking because they want you to say it out loud. The NDA does not override regulatory obligations, Marcus said carefully. That would be good, Vivian said. Then we have a shared understanding there. Grant leaned forward slightly. Vivian, the number is fair. It's more than fair. You know what you came into this marriage with, and I'd like to address the terms, Vivian said, and now she opened the leather folder in front of her for the first time. Specifically, I'd like to decline them. The room shifted. Grant's expression did not change immediately. That was his particular talent. The executive face. The face that had survived board collapses and press crises, and the specific pressure of being watched by people who are looking for any sign of weakness. But something behind the eyes moved. Something recalculated. Decline the $10 million, he said. Decline the NDA, Vivian said. Decline the asset division as presented, and decline the timeline. Camille made a small sound, not quite a word, just a breath of something between surprise and contempt. Grant put his hand briefly on the table near her, the quieting gesture of someone managing more than one thing at once. Vivian, he said, and now his voice had shifted from genial to measured, the shift that happened when Grant Sterling moved from the version of himself that performed patience to the version that had run out of it. I don't know who convinced you to walk in here, and I'd like to now address the primary matter, Jonathan Graves said. It was the first time he had spoken since entering the room. His voice was low and carried the specific gravity of someone who does not waste words and therefore has trained you within minutes of meeting him to pay attention to the ones he uses. Every person in the room looked at him. Grant looked at him. My name is Jonathan Graves, Jonathan said. I serve as primary legal executor and estate counsel for the Ashbourne Family Trust. I've held that position for 23 years. He paused and let that sit. My client is Vivian Ashbourne. He said it the way you say the name of something that has existed for a very long time, not as an announcement, as a clarification. Grant frowned. Her name is Sterling. Her legal name is Vivian Ashbourne Sterling, Jonathan said. The Ashbourne name is the operative one for our purposes this morning. He opened his own folder. Before we discuss the terms of dissolution, I'd like to table a preliminary document. This is a notification of interest filing on behalf of Ashbourne Global Infrastructure regarding several active contracts that are currently registered under Sterling Vector's operational framework. Marcus Hale looked at the document his associate had just been handed across the table. He read 3 lines. His face did not change, but his hands went very slightly still. What is this? Grant said. It's a notification, Jonathan said pleasantly. Routine procedural step. Ashbourne Global holds infrastructure licensing agreements that underpin several of Sterling Vector's core logistics systems. The filing simply notifies relevant parties that those agreements are under review, given the changed circumstances in the principal's marital status. Grant stared at him. Sterling Vector doesn't have any agreements with a company called Ashbourne Global. Not directly, Jonathan said. The agreements run through 3 intermediary entities, Meridian Logistics Partners, Pacific Gateway Infrastructure, and Cross-Continental Supply Systems, all 3 of which are wholly owned subsidiaries of Ashbourne Global Infrastructure Trust. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. It was the silence of a room in which the air had just changed composition. Grant looked at Marcus. Marcus was reading. His face was doing something careful and controlled that was not entirely succeeding. "How large are these agreements?" Marcus asked, and his voice was professional, but with an edge to it. The edge that appears when a lawyer realizes that the terrain they prepared for is not the terrain they're actually standing on. Combined, they represent approximately 31% of Sterling Vector's active supply chain operations, Jonathan said. He said it the way you say the temperature outside, factual neutral, entirely without drama, which somehow made it dramatically worse. The licensing architecture is somewhat layered. It took our team several months to document it comprehensively. I have the full summary here if you'd like it. He slid a bound document across the table. No one picked it up immediately. Grant did not move. He was sitting very still in the way that powerful men go still when something has happened that they do not yet have language for. Camille had stopped looking composed. She was looking at the document on the table with the specific expression of someone watching a structure they thought was solid, beginning to move in ways structures are not supposed to move. "This is not possible," Grant said. His voice was flat. "I know every entity that Sterling Vector contracts with. I have reviewed those contracts personally. You reviewed the surface contracts," Jonathan said, not unkindly. "The intermediary agreements are 3 layers deep. The Ashbourne Trust has been a silent infrastructure partner for..." He checked his notes, though Vivian suspected he did not actually need to check them 7 years. "The initial agreement predates your Series C funding round by 4 months. Grant turned and looked at Vivian. It was the first time since she'd walked into the room that he looked at her with something other than the controlled authority he normally wore. He looked at her the way a person looks at something familiar that has just revealed itself to be something else entirely, not a stranger, but not what they thought either. Something that was always there and always different. 7 years, he said. Vivian said nothing. 7 years, he said again. And now there was something raw underneath the word, not quite anger and not quite fear, something that was just the sound a man makes when the map he's been navigating by turns out to have been drawn by someone else. "The agreements are legitimate, fully documented, and have been in compliance at every stage," Jonathan said. "There is no issue of legality here. What there is," he took a single sheet from his folder and set it on the table, "is a clause in the original licensing agreement with Pacific Gateway Infrastructure that includes a review and reversion provision. In the event of certain material changes in the relationship between the licensed party and the Ashbourne Trust, including specifically formal dissolution of a marital relationship involving a principal member of the Ashbourne family, the Trust reserves the right to review all dependent licensing arrangements." Marcus Hale set down the document he was reading. He picked up the single sheet Jonathan had just placed on the table. He read it. He set it down. He took off his glasses, which was something Vivian had been told by Eleanor that Marcus Hale almost never did during a meeting. "Marcus," Grant said. "Give me a minute," Marcus said. "Marcus." "Grant." And Marcus's voice had something in it that it had not had 40 minutes ago, a gravity. The gravity of a man who has just realized that the room he confidently walked into is approximately 5 times more complicated than the room he thought he was walking into. "Give me a minute." Camille leaned toward Grant and said quietly, "This has to be, they can't actually." And Grant put his hand on the table again, and she stopped. Jonathan Graves waited. He had been in rooms like this one before, rooms where a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for a long time was making its way to the surface. And he knew that the most powerful thing you could do in these moments was simply not fill the silence. Let the silence do its work. Vivian also waited. She had her hands folded in front of her on the table, and she was watching her husband, and her expression was not triumphant, not cold, not satisfied in any theatrical sense. It was the expression of a woman who is watching something she has known for a long time be discovered by someone who is encountering it for the first time. "The Ashbourne family," Grant said finally, and his voice had a strange quality to it. The quality of a man working through something with deliberate care, because if he stops being deliberate, he is afraid of what will come out. "You're saying Vivian is..." "My client is the primary heir to the Ashbourne Global Infrastructure Trust," Jonathan said. "The trust currently manages infrastructure assets in 41 countries with a consolidated valuation. And here he paused, and even Jonathan Graves, who had been doing this for decades, seemed to give the next number the appropriate weight of approximately $3 trillion. The number sat in the middle of the table like an object. Camille made a sound. She covered it. But she made it. Grant stared at Jonathan Graves for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Vivian. $3 trillion, he said. The valuation fluctuates, Jonathan said. $3 trillion, Grant said, again. And now there was nothing executive about his voice. There was just a man sitting across a table from his wife of 11 years, trying to hold together a sense of reality that had just been restructured at its foundation. Vivian looked at him, and for the first time all morning, something moved across her face. Not pity exactly, but something adjacent to it. The complicated feeling of watching a person understand something they should have tried to understand a long time ago. You never asked, she said quietly. Just the two of them for a moment in the middle of the room, in the middle of everything. In 11 years, you never asked. About your family, he said. About who I was, she said. You asked about who I was to you, who I was as your wife, your partner, the woman who showed up at your events and managed your household and made things smooth when things needed to be smooth. You asked about that person constantly. You never asked about the one who existed before her. Grant opened his mouth, closed it. The 10 million, Vivian said. And the way she said it was not cruel, but it was precise surgical, the way things are surgical, when they are cutting through to something true. Was you offering me what you believed I was worth, based on who you thought I was? She held his gaze. I wanted you to know who you were actually negotiating with. The room was completely silent. Then Grant Sterling did something that no one in that room expected. Not Marcus, not Jonathan, not Camille, and honestly not Vivian either. He laughed, not with humor, not with anger. He laughed the way people laugh when something is so far outside the range of what they were prepared for that laughter is the only available response, the short, disbelieving sound of a man trying to find the edges of something that suddenly has no edges he can locate. $3 trillion, he said again almost to himself. We can continue the dissolution proceedings, Jonathan said back to business with the ease of someone who has allowed the emotional moment its necessary space and is now returning them to the functional matter at hand. But the terms as presented are no longer operative. The Ashbourne Trust's interests in Sterling Vector's infrastructure will need to be addressed separately, and that process will require a full accounting of all dependent systems. That accounting, he checked his watch, has actually already been requested by our team as of this morning. Regulatory filing was submitted at 8:47 a.m. Marcus Hale looked up sharply. What kind of regulatory filing? Standard infrastructure interest disclosure, Jonathan said. Nothing punitive, simply a matter of record notifying the relevant oversight bodies that the Ashbourne Trust is conducting a review of its interests in several logistics and supply chain companies. Sterling Vector is one of 9 companies named. The others are partners, subsidiaries, competitors. He paused. Market will likely notice the filing by end of day. These things tend to move quickly. Grant understood what that meant before anyone else in the room did. He understood it because he had spent 20 years in the world of investment markets and supply chain finance. And he knew in his bones, the way you know things you have lived by for your entire career, what it meant when a $3 trillion infrastructure trust publicly announced a review of its interests in a $9 billion company. It meant the stock would move. It meant partners would call. It meant the phone would start ringing before noon and not stop. He stood up. It was not a controlled movement. It was the movement of a man whose body has decided to react before his mind has finished forming the decision. He planted his hands on the table and looked at Vivian. Call it off, he said. The filing. Call it off. Vivian looked up at him. Jonathan filed it on his own authority as trust executor. It's not mine to call off. You're the principal heir. I'm his client, Vivian said, not his director. The trust has its own governance. I don't give Jonathan orders. I gave him instructions that I was proceeding with the dissolution and the trust's standard review protocols activated. That's how it works. It was true. And it was also the most precise possible version of the truth, which is a very different thing from the complete version of the truth, and everyone in the room knew it. But there was nothing to grab onto. What do you want? Grant said. And now his voice was stripped of everything: the executive register, the casual authority, the practiced confidence of a man who had never in his adult life sat across from someone who had more than he did. It was just a question, a real one, from a man who was beginning to understand that he had been in a position he didn't know he was in for a very long time. Vivian studied him for a moment. Then she said, "I want what I've always wanted, Grant. I want to be treated like someone who was real." She picked up her folder. "My attorneys will send your attorneys our proposed terms by end of day. They'll be reasonable. Jonathan will vouch for that." She stood. "I'm not trying to destroy you." She said it clearly, and she meant it, and somehow that was the most frightening thing she had said in the entire meeting. Jonathan Graves rose beside her. He gathered his documents with the neat, unhurried competence of a man who had achieved everything he came to achieve. He nodded to Marcus Hale with the professional courtesy of one attorney acknowledging another across the aftermath of a catastrophic development. Vivian walked to the door. "Vivian," Grant said. She stopped, did not turn around. "Did you know," he said, "when we got married, did you know it would come to this?" A pause, long enough to be honest. "No," she said. "I married you because I loved you. What I know now, I learned in the 11 years after that." She put her hand on the door. "I prepared for this because of who you became, not who you were." She walked out. In the elevator on the way down, Jonathan looked at her without speaking for a moment. The floors counted down in silence. "How are you?" he asked. Vivian leaned her head back slightly against the elevator wall, closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then opened them. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. Her phone buzzed as they reached the lobby. She looked at it. A message from a number she recognized, one of the 17 people in 6 countries she had messaged 4 nights ago from her desk. It read, "Pacific Gateway just received 3 incoming calls from Sterling Vector Operations. They are asking questions. How do we respond?" She typed back, "Standard protocol. Be polite. Be accurate. Tell them the review is ongoing." She put the phone in her pocket, walked through the lobby, through the glass doors, out into the city, which was bright and moving and completely indifferent to the specific shape of the morning she had just had. The Ashbourne name was in the world now, and somewhere above her, on a floor of a building she had just left, Grant Sterling was sitting in a conference room with his attorney and his CFO, and a document none of them had been prepared for, and his phone was starting to ring. It would not stop for a very long time. The regulatory filing hit the market at 2:17 in the afternoon. Grant knew the exact minute because he was sitting in Marcus Hale's conference room when his head of investor relations, a man named Derek Sue, called and said 4 words in a voice that had no business being as calm as it was: "The stock is moving." "How much?" Grant said. 11% in 9 minutes, Derek said, "and it's not stopping. We've got 3 institutional holders on the line asking for a statement. I don't have a statement." Grant looked at Marcus across the table. Camille had her phone out and was reading something on the screen with the fixed, slightly bloodless expression of someone who has just opened a door and found a room significantly larger and darker than they expected. "Get me the board," Grant said to Derek. "Emergency call. 1 hour." "They're already calling each other," Derek said. "I don't think you're going to have to convene it. I think it's going to convene itself." Grant ended the call, put the phone on the table, looked at Marcus. "How bad is it?" he said. Marcus had spent the last 2 hours reading the documents Jonathan Graves had left behind, and his face had been doing progressively less successful things throughout that process. He took off his glasses again the second time in 1 day, which Vivian had been told was essentially unprecedented, and set them on top of the bound document. "The Pacific Gateway Agreement alone is significant," Marcus said. "But it's not just the size of it, it's the architecture. The way the licensing agreements are structured, they're load-bearing. They're not supplementary contracts, Grant. They're infrastructure. They sit underneath systems you assumed you owned outright." He paused. "Your legal team approved these contracts at the time. They approved the surface structure. No one went 3 layers deep." "Because there was no reason to go 3 layers deep," Grant said, and his voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something audible in the way each word arrived slightly more separate from the last than it normally would. "Because I had no reason to believe my wife was—" He stopped. Camille looked up from her phone. Grant, the suppliers. What about them? She turned the screen toward him. A message from their chief operations officer sent 2 minutes ago. It read, Meridian Logistics, just requested a formal review of our Q3 contract renewal. Pacific Gateway has gone silent on the Mumbai expansion call. Cross Continental is asking us to delay the Singapore signing. What is happening? Grant read it again. His jaw was tight in the specific way that jaws get tight when a person is working very hard to be the version of themselves that handles things, because the version that doesn't handle things is somewhere right below the surface, making noise. They haven't pulled out, Marcus said carefully, reading over Grant's shoulder. They're asking for delays, reviews. That's not termination. That's the beginning of termination, Grant said flatly. I've done this. I know what a strategic pause looks like from a partner who's been given a reason to reconsider. Someone told them to slow down. Marcus said nothing because Grant was not wrong. Camille put her phone face down on the table and looked at Grant. And for the first time since she'd sat down in that conference room 8 hours ago, she looked less like a CFO and more like a person uncertain in the way that people get uncertain when the plan they were part of turns out to have been built on information that was never complete. She did this on purpose, Camille said. This morning wasn't just about the divorce. She came in here to show us what she had. Yes, Grant said. The question is how much she's actually willing to use it, Camille said. Grant looked at her, and something crossed his face. A complex movement quick that was not quite the expression of a man talking to his CFO, and not quite the expression of a man talking to someone he had brought to a gala and seated in his wife's chair. It was the expression of a man who is beginning to do a different kind of accounting than the kind he's used to not assets and liabilities on a financial sheet, but the accounting of choices and what they cost and who ends up paying. She told me she wasn't trying to destroy me, he said. Camille tilted her head slightly. And you believed her? He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. By 4:30, the board had convened. Not in person. There was no time for that, but on a video call that Grant joined from a private room in Marcus's offices, 12 faces in 12 different frames, the particular geometry of a crisis that has found its way to people who did not see it coming and are now trying to appear as though they are the kind of people who can handle things they did not see coming. Richard Cho, the board chair, was 63, Hong Kong-born, and had been in finance long enough to have survived 4 market crashes without blinking. He blinked now. Grant, he said when the pleasantries, such as they were, had been dispensed with. We need to understand the scope of the Ashbourne exposure. Marcus's team is compiling the full picture, Grant said. I'm not asking about your attorney's team, Richard said. I'm asking you. Did you know? The 12 faces waited. No, Grant said. Your wife, Richard started. My soon-to-be ex-wife, Grant said. Your soon-to-be ex-wife, Richard said, with the deliberate patience of a man who does not consider the distinction relevant to the crisis at hand, is the primary heir to a $3 trillion infrastructure trust that holds licensing agreements underpinning 31% of our active operations. And you had no knowledge of this. That's correct. The silence on the call had its own texture, 12 people in 12 frames, all of them doing their own math. Grant. That was Patricia Vane, 67, lead independent director, former Treasury official, the kind of woman who had been the only woman in enough rooms to have stopped caring about the optics of saying what needed to be said. I've been on this board for 6 years. In that time, I have asked you at every major M&A review whether there were any undisclosed relationships or entanglements that could affect our contractual standing. You have told me no. Every time. Because I believed it was no, Grant said. You believed it, Patricia said, but you didn't verify it. She's my wife. She was your wife, Patricia said, and apparently also the heir to the family that owns the infrastructure your company runs on. And you didn't know. And we didn't know. And right now, our stock is down 16% because the market knows something is happening even if it doesn't know exactly what. And by tomorrow morning, she paused. By tomorrow morning, the analysts are going to start digging. And when they find the structure of those licensing agreements, which they will find, Grant, because it is now a matter of public regulatory record. She stopped. Let that finish itself. Richard Cho spoke again. We need to discuss the question of leadership stability. Grant went very still. Richard, no one is making a decision tonight, Richard said. I want to be clear about that. We are not making any decisions tonight, but we need to acknowledge that this board has a fiduciary obligation, and that obligation requires us to, at minimum, have the conversation about whether the current leadership structure— I built this company, Grant said. His voice was quiet, not heated quiet, which was more alarming in its own way than if it had been heated. I built it from 11 employees and a seed round that most people in this city told me to stop chasing. I built Sterling Vector from nothing. This is not a leadership stability issue. This is a legal and contractual situation that we are going to address and resolve, and I need the board to be steady while we do that. Patricia Vane looked at him through the screen. And the Ashbourne family? Are they going to let you resolve it? He had no answer for that. The call ended at 5:58. Grant sat alone in the room for 4 minutes before Camille knocked and came in. She sat down across from him. They looked at each other across the table the way two people look at each other when they have been through something together and the something has changed the shape of what they are to each other, and neither of them is entirely sure yet what the new shape is. Patricia's going to push for an emergency review, Camille said. I know. The stock needs to stabilize, she said. If it's still dropping tomorrow morning, the institutional holders are going to start calling for statements, and statements are going to require disclosures, and disclosures are going to require— Camille, he said. She stopped. What did you think this was, he said, not accusatory, not cold, genuinely asking, when you came with me tonight, when you sat at that table, when we walked into that meeting this morning together. He looked at her. What did you think it was going to look like on the other side? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, which was the most honest thing she'd done all day. I thought it was going to be simpler, she said. So did I, he said. He stood up, put on his jacket, picked up his phone and looked at it. 17 missed calls, 4 from board members, 2 from his head of PR, 1 from a journalist he'd known for years who had never called him directly before tonight. He put the phone in his pocket without calling any of them back. I need to talk to her, he said. Camille looked up sharply. Grant, not to beg, he said, not to negotiate. I just need to— He stopped, searched for the word. I need to understand what she's actually going to do. Jonathan Graves will tell you to go through counsel. I'm not calling Jonathan Graves, he said. I'm calling my wife. Vivian was home when her phone rang at 6:22. She was in the kitchen, which is where she went when she needed to think, because the kitchen had always been the one room in the apartment that felt entirely hers, not designed for impression, not arranged for guests, just functional and real in the way that she had always valued in things. She saw Grant's name on the screen, let it ring twice, then picked up. Grant, she said. 16%, he said. As of close. I saw. The board is going to move against me if it goes lower tomorrow, he said. You know that. Yes. Did you know it would move this fast? She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was yes, she had, because she had spent 3 years learning exactly how markets respond to infrastructure uncertainty at the licensing level, and because Jonathan's team had been extraordinarily precise about the timing of the regulatory filing. But the honest answer was also more complicated than that. I knew it would move, she said. I didn't design the speed. Is there a difference? There's always a difference, she said, between knowing something will happen and engineering exactly how it happens. Jonathan's obligation is to the trust. The trust's obligation is to its own governance protocols. Once I told Jonathan to proceed, the mechanisms operated the way they always operate. I didn't make any calls today, Grant. I didn't tell anyone to slow down. I didn't instruct Ashbourne's partners to put anything on pause. But they did anyway, he said. Yes, she said. Because when a $3 trillion trust files a review notice, the people who are connected to that trust become cautious. That's not a manipulation, that's just how trust works. And distrust, she paused. Both of them. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing. Not fast, just present the sound of a man standing somewhere in the particular dark that descends when you understand that the story you've been telling yourself about your own life has been missing a significant chapter. "What do you want, Vivian?" he asked. It was the same question he'd asked in the meeting room, but it was different now. Then it had been a tactical question. Now it was something else. "I already told you," she said. "I want to be treated like someone who is real." "Is there a version of this," he said, "where the company survives, where we settle the dissolution and the trust steps back from the review, and the dissolution and the trust review are separate processes," she said. "I've told you that. Jonathan will tell you that. The review is a governance matter for the Ashbourne board, not a negotiating chip for me." "But you have influence." "Grant," her voice was patient and direct, "you want me to use my family's resources to save your company. After you offered me $10 million to disappear and brought your mistress to sit in my chair at a public event, I want you to hear yourself." A long pause. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I hear it." She said nothing. "I didn't know," he said, "about the Ashbourne name, about any of it. I know that doesn't change anything. I know you're going to say I should have asked, and you're right that I should have asked. But I want you to know I genuinely did not know." "I know you didn't," she said. And the thing was, she did know it. She had known it for years. Grant Sterling was many things, and some of those things were not good. But he was not a man who had married her knowing what she was, and decided it was worth it for the access. He had genuinely had no idea. He had looked at her and seen a woman he loved, and then slowly over 11 years had seen a woman he had stopped looking at. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and the combination of them was what made the whole situation as sad as it was. "The board might move by end of week," he said. "I know. If they remove me from the company I built." "Grant," she said, "I can't save Sterling Vector for you, but I can tell you what I intend to do on my side, and you can make decisions based on that." She took a breath. "The dissolution terms Jonathan sends over are fair. I'm not taking the company. I'm not touching the stock structure. I want what's mine from the marriage, which is considerably less than I'm legally entitled to as an Ashbourne heir, and considerably more than $10 million, and I want my freedom. That's it. Whatever happens with the Ashbourne Trust Review is a separate matter and will run its own course." "How long will the review take?" "That depends on what they find," she said, "and how cooperative Sterling Vector's team is with the information requests." He understood what that meant. "If I make the documentation available," he said, "the internal architecture, the full licensing system breakdown, then the review proceeds efficiently," she said. "If it doesn't, it takes longer, and while it takes longer, the uncertainty stays in the market, and you know what uncertainty does to stock price better than anyone I've ever known." It was not a threat. It was a fact stated cleanly without embellishment, which is precisely what made it so effective. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Another pause. Not tense this time, just present. "Vivian," he said, "for what it's worth, the gala, the seat, the things I said, Grant." She stopped him, not unkindly. "Don't apologize for the wrong things. You didn't just have a bad night. You had a long pattern. And apologizing for one night doesn't address the pattern. When you figure out how to address the pattern, not to me, I don't need it from you, but in yourself somewhere that'll mean something." She paused. "For your own sake." He had no answer for that either. "Good night, Grant," she said. "Good night, Vivian," he said. She put the phone down, stood in the kitchen for a moment, put her hands flat on the counter, breathed. Then she picked the phone back up and texted Eleanor. He called. "It's going the way it needs to go." "I'm fine." Eleanor wrote back within 30 seconds. "Are you actually fine, or are you fine?" Vivian almost smiled. She texted both. "Give me 2 days." Eleanor sent back a single period, which was Eleanor's way of saying, "I see you, I'm here, go do what you need to do." The next morning, Thursday's edition of the Financial Journal ran a front-page analysis piece on Sterling Vector's stock decline and the Ashbourne Global regulatory filing. The journalist had done their work fast and done it well. Not all the layers, not the deepest architecture, but enough. Enough for the headline to read, "Infrastructure Mystery, Who is the Ashbourne Trust and How Deep Does It Go in Sterling Vector's Supply Chain?" Grant read it at 6 a.m. He read it standing up, which was how he read things when the content required him to be ready to move. By 6:45, his phone had 29 missed calls. By 7, Derek Sue was in his apartment, which was notable because Derek had never once in 4 years been in Grant's apartment with a laptop and a printed briefing sheet, and the expression of a man who has not slept and is running on the specific adrenaline of someone managing a crisis that is larger than the crisis management tools they were issued. "The journal piece is secondary," Derek said before he'd even sat down. "The primary problem is Goldman. Their equity desk ran the filing through their compliance system overnight, and they've identified the Pacific Gateway connection. They're calling it a material undisclosed dependency. I got a call at 5 a.m. from their head of equities asking for a statement." "What did you tell them?" "That I would have a statement by 9 a.m., Derek said. "I don't have a statement," Grant said. "I know," Derek said, "which is why I'm here at 7 in the morning." Grant sat down. He had the look of a man who has been awake for a while, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he chose not to, staying awake being the only form of control that was still fully available to him. "If Goldman moves," Grant said. "They'll move by noon," Derek said. "Their holding is 12% of the float. If they signal intent to reduce, the other institutional holders are going to interpret it as the smart money deciding something, and the stock goes where?" Derek looked at the numbers on his laptop. "Our worst-case projection this morning is a 43% decline from last week's close-by end-of-day Friday. If that happens..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. 43% from a $9 billion valuation was a number that had words attached to it that neither of them wanted to say out loud in an apartment at 7 in the morning. "Get me Marcus," Grant said, "and get me Jonathan Graves's number." Derek looked up. "Graves is opposing counsel." "I know what he is," Grant said. "Get me the number." Derek got him the number. Grant called Jonathan Graves at 7:22, and Jonathan picked up on the second ring, which told Grant that Jonathan Graves had also been awake for a while and had also been expecting this call. "Mr. Sterling," Jonathan said. "How cooperative do you need us to be?" Grant said. No preamble, no pretense. He had made the decision sometime in the night that he was done operating from the posture of a man who had more information than he had. On the documentation requests, the internal architecture review. If I open everything full transparency, how does that change the timeline on the trust review? Jonathan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was not warmer exactly, but different in some small way that acknowledged what it took for Grant Sterling to make this phone call. If Sterling Vector provides full documentation access by end of this week, our team can complete the initial review within 30 days. At that point, the trust would issue a formal status notice, either confirming the existing licensing arrangements or outlining conditions for their continuation. And if they confirm the existing arrangements, then the market has its answer, Jonathan said. The uncertainty resolves. You still have the dissolution proceedings to manage separately, but the infrastructure question closes. And what are the odds of them confirming? Grant said. Jonathan paused again in the way that attorneys pause when they are considering how much of the truth they owe the person they're talking to. The licensing arrangements have been in good standing for 7 years, he said. The trust does not dissolve functioning arrangements without cause. The review is procedural, not punitive. I cannot speak to the outcome, that's the trust's board to determine. But I can tell you that my client is not seeking to destroy Sterling Vector. She told me the same thing, Grant said. She meant it, Jonathan said. My client has a very clear sense of what she wants from this situation. Destruction is not on the list. Grant absorbed that. I'll have my team open the documentation portal today, he said. Tell your review team they'll have full access by noon. I'll let them know, Jonathan said. Then, after a small pause, Mr. Sterling, for what it's worth, she did not come to Thursday's meeting to humiliate you. She came to make sure you understood who you were dealing with. There's a difference. I'm beginning to understand that, Grant said. He ended the call, set the phone down, looked at Derek, who had been sitting very still and very silent for the duration of the call, with the focused attention of someone storing every detail for later. Noon, Grant said. Full documentation access. Get the technology team on it now. Derek nodded and stood, and was already texting as he moved toward the door. Grant sat alone for a moment. The apartment was quiet, the way apartments are quiet when a person who used to share them suddenly doesn't. It was a particular kind of quiet, not peaceful, not comfortable. Just the specific acoustic texture of space that has more room in it than the person living in it currently needs. He thought about the gala, the name card, the way he had grabbed her arm, the way she had looked at him before she walked away. Not with hurt, not with anger, but with that particular stillness that he now understood, finally, had never been acceptance. Had always been something else, something he had spent 11 years mistaking for one thing when it was another. He thought about what she had said on the phone. Don't apologize for the wrong things. You didn't just have a bad night. You had a long pattern. He had been building his empire for 20 years. He had been building it on speed and instinct and the absolute confidence that he understood every system he operated within, every variable, every dependency. He had been wrong about the most important one. He had been wrong in the most expensive way a person can be wrong, not in a single decision but in a sustained failure to ask the question. He hadn't asked, and she had waited, and he had kept not asking, and she had kept waiting. And at some point, the waiting had transformed into something else, into preparation, into the silent assembly of everything she needed for the moment he made it impossible to wait any longer. He stood up, walked to the window, looked at the city the same way he had looked at it 10,000 times before, with ownership, with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who felt that he and the city had an understanding. For the first time, he was not sure that was true. His phone rang. It was Richard Cho. He let it ring once, twice, then he picked it up. "Richard," he said. "The Goldman call is in 40 minutes, Richard said. "I need you present. And Grant," the board chair paused, "I need you to be honest with them about what you know and what you didn't know. The board can work with honesty right now. What we can't work with is any version of this morning that sounds like you're still managing the narrative." Grant looked out at the city. "I know," he said. "Do you?" Richard said. "Yes," Grant said. "I finally do." He hung up, put on his jacket, picked up his keys, and walked out of the apartment that still had her presence in every room she'd ever sat, in subtle quiet, and now, like everything else about her, impossible to ignore once you finally started looking. The Goldman call was in 40 minutes. The documentation portal opened at noon. The trust review would take 30 days. And somewhere across the city, Vivian Ashbourne was sitting in the kitchen of an apartment she was about to stop living in, drinking her tea and looking at a list of properties she was considering for the next phase of something she had been building quietly, patiently, completely, for longer than anyone around her had known to look. The 30 days of the Ashbourne Trust Review were the longest 30 days of Grant Sterling's professional life, and he had lived through some long ones. He had survived the 2016 funding collapse that nearly killed Sterling Vector in its third year. He had survived the supply chain crisis of 2021 that wiped out 3 of his competitors and left his own company bleeding from every operational artery for 11 months. He had survived a hostile takeover attempt in 2023 that his board had called unsurvivable, and that he had dismantled through 3 consecutive all-night sessions with Marcus Hale, and a level of strategic aggression that had become in certain circles something close to legend. He had not survived anything like this. The difference was simple and devastating. Every previous crisis had been a problem he could see from the front. He knew the shape of it. He knew what winning looked like. He could point at a target and move every resource he had toward it with the focused velocity that had always been his defining competitive advantage. This was not a crisis with a front. This was a crisis that lived underneath things. Every system he reached for turned out to have a layer below it that he hadn't mapped, and below that layer another. And the further down he went, the more clearly he understood that the architecture of his own company had been constructed on a foundation whose owner he had been sharing a bed with for 11 years without once thinking to ask whose name was on the deed. The Goldman call had gone badly. Not catastrophically, Grant had been honest, as Richard Cho asked, and honesty in a crisis has a stabilizing effect that spin does not, but badly enough. Goldman reduced their position by 40%. The stock dropped an additional 9 points by the end of that day, which was Friday, which meant the weekend financial press had 2 full days to run analysis pieces, and they used every hour of it. By Monday, Sterling Vector was the most talked about corporate story in the country. Not for anything Grant had built, for everything he apparently hadn't known about what he'd built it on. The documentation review proceeded on schedule. Grant's technology team opened everything full architecture, full licensing documentation, internal system maps, with a transparency that even Jonathan Graves's review team noted in their formal acknowledgement was unusually complete. Grant had made that decision deliberately, and it was the right one. And it did not feel like the right one because it felt like surrender, and Grant Sterling had not been built for surrender. Marcus Hale told him twice that it wasn't surrender. It's positioning, Marcus said on the 12th day of the review. They were in Marcus's office, which had become Grant's default location for every conversation he didn't want to have in his own apartment. You're demonstrating good faith to the Trust's review board and to the market simultaneously. That matters. It matters if the Trust confirms the agreements, Grant said. And if they don't, then it doesn't matter at all, Grant said, because nothing else will either. Marcus looked at him. It's accurate, Grant said. Let's just be accurate, Marcus. We're past the point where we benefit from framing. Marcus let it go. Camille had not been in the office on the Monday after the gala. She had not been in on Tuesday either. On Wednesday, she sent Grant a message that was professional in structure and personal in content. The message of someone who has made a decision they have the self-awareness to understand they made slightly too late. She said she needed to step back from the CFO role temporarily while the board conducted its governance review, that she believed it was the right thing for the company, and that she hoped he understood. He understood. He told her he understood. He meant it, which surprised him slightly. What he did not say, and what he spent a considerable amount of time not saying in the privacy of his own mind, was that he had spent 12 days lying awake at night reviewing the sequence of events that had led to a gala, a seat card, a conference room, and the name Ashbourne, and that somewhere in that review, the figure of Camille Laurent had stopped looking like a future and started looking like a decision he had made in the place of a harder and more honest one. He did not say that, but he thought it with the specific discomfort of a man who has been honest about external things and is now being required to be honest about internal ones. The dissolution proceedings moved through their own separate channel. Jonathan Graves's proposed terms arrived as promised the evening of the Thursday meeting. Grant's team reviewed them. Marcus called Grant at 9 p.m. that same night. "They're fair," Marcus said. "More than fair, actually. She's not taking the company equity. She's not claiming the patents. She's asking for a cash settlement of $42 million, which, given what she's entitled to claim under an Ashbourne family assets declaration," Marcus paused, "is approximately 4% of what she could legally pursue." Grant held the phone very still. 4%. The Ashbourne family attorneys could make an argument for marital asset recalculation that would put her claim somewhere in the range of... Marcus stopped. "It would be a very large number, Grant. She's not making that argument. She's taking $42 million, her personal effects, and her freedom. That's it." "Why?" Grant said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "because she meant what she said. She's not trying to destroy you. She's trying to leave." Grant signed the dissolution terms on day 18 of the review. He signed them alone at his desk at 7 in the morning with Marcus on the phone for legal confirmation. When it was done, he sat for a moment with the pen still in his hand, and he did something he had not done in a very long time and would not have admitted to doing if anyone had been in the room to see it. He sat with it. Just sat with what he had done and what it had cost and what it meant without moving on to the next thing, without converting the feeling into action, without reaching for the particular forward momentum that had always been his way of not feeling what he was feeling. He sat with it for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which for Grant Sterling was approximately 4 minutes longer than usual, and when he put the pen down, something had shifted in him that was not yet wisdom, but was at least the beginning of understanding that wisdom was a thing he was going to need. The Ashbourne Trust Review Board issued its determination on day 31. 1 day late, which Jonathan told Vivian was within normal variance and did not indicate anything directional. Vivian received the determination document at her brother's house in Geneva, where she had gone on day 20 of the review, not to hide, not to escape, but because it was the first time in 11 years she had allowed herself to simply be somewhere without a role to perform. The determination arrived by encrypted document, and she read it in the study with a cup of coffee that had gone cold because she'd forgotten to drink it. The trust confirmed all existing licensing arrangements with Sterling Vector, full continuation. All three entities, Meridian, Pacific, Gateway, Cross-Continental, would honor their existing contracts through the end of their current terms. It was the best possible outcome for Sterling Vector, and it was still not enough, because on day 29, the morning before the determination arrived, something else had come to light. It came through Marcus Hale, which was how the most consequential things in this entire story tended to arrive quietly through a professional channel in the voice of a careful man who had spent decades measuring every word he said in a crisis, and who on this particular morning sounded as though he was measuring them slightly more carefully than usual. He called Grant at 6:50 a.m. "The bankruptcy filing," Marcus said. Grant sat up. "What bankruptcy filing?" "The Chapter 11 filing," Marcus said. "It came through overnight. The petition was filed yesterday evening in the Southern District of New York. The creditors, specifically the consortium of lenders who hold the infrastructure financing from the 2022 expansion, have called the debt." Grant's first thought was that Marcus was wrong. His second thought was that Marcus was never wrong about this kind of thing. His third thought came with a cold, spreading clarity that moved through him from his chest outward, the way very bad news moves through people who are already braced for bad news, but not for this particular shape of it. "The expansion financing," he said, "the 2022 round. That was secured against the Pacific Gateway and Cross-Continental licensing frameworks." "Correct," Marcus said, "which means when the Ashbourne Trust filed the review notice, the lenders interpreted it as a material uncertainty event," Marcus said. "It triggered the acceleration clause in the loan agreement. The debt became immediately callable." "How much?" Grant said. Marcus told him. Grant put the phone down for a moment. Not to be dramatic, just because he needed his hands to be free for a second while he absorbed the number. Then he picked it back up. "Can we restructure?" he said. "We're exploring it," Marcus said. "But Grant, the patents." Everything stopped. "What about the patents?" Grant said. Marcus's pause was 3 seconds long, which in 11 years of working together was the longest pause Grant had ever heard from him. "In the original 2019 agreement with Pacific Gateway Infrastructure," Marcus said, "there is a clause we missed. Our team missed it. I'm telling you directly because there's no version of this where I don't tell you directly." Another pause. "The clause is a reversion provision on the core logistics AI patents, the foundational IP that Sterling Vector's entire technology platform is built on. In the event of a formal insolvency proceeding involving the licensed party." "Marcus," Grant said. His voice was very quiet. "The patents revert," Marcus said, "to the Ashbourne Trust. Full reversion. No compensation. It's there in the original document. It's been there since 2019. The silence that followed was the longest silence in the story so far. Longer than the silence at the gala. Longer than the silence in the conference room when Jonathan Graves said $3 trillion. This silence had a different quality, the quality of a man standing at the edge of something and looking down and finally understanding how far down it goes. "The patents are the company," Grant said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Without the patents, there's no Sterling Vector. There's no technology. There's no product. There's no—" "Yes," Marcus said again. He said it quietly, and he said it with what Grant recognized even then as genuine grief, the grief of a man who has worked alongside someone for a decade and is now required to tell them that the ground has completely disappeared. "Did she know?" Grant said. "About this clause specifically. Did Vivian know?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "I can tell you that Jonathan Graves knew, and I can tell you that Jonathan Graves does not miss things in documents." Grant stood up. He walked from his desk to the window, the same window he had looked out of the morning after the determination call, the morning he had decided to be honest with Goldman. And he looked at the city again, and the city looked back at him with the same magnificent indifference it had always shown, and he understood in that moment that the city had never had a relationship with him at all. He had just believed it did. "When is the bankruptcy hearing?" he said. 3 weeks, Marcus said. "Southern District, Judge Carla Whitmore. She runs a clean courtroom, no delays, no tolerance for procedural games. Whatever we go in with, it needs to be the real picture." "It'll be the real picture," Grant said. He had nothing else to say. The 3 weeks between the bankruptcy filing and the hearing were a kind of controlled demolition. Grant watched his company disassemble itself in the specific slow-motion way of things that are structurally compromised not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece taking something with it when it went. 3 senior executives resigned. One of them had been with Grant since the beginning, a logistics director named Paul Chen, who had worked 16-hour days during the 2021 crisis, and who called Grant personally before submitting his letter, which Grant had not expected, and which cost him more in some private way than any of the market numbers. "I'm sorry," Paul said on the phone. "I need you to know I'm not doing this because I don't respect what you built." "I know," Grant said. "I'm doing it because I have a family," Paul said. "And I can't," Grant said. "You don't need to explain it to me, I understand." He understood. He kept understanding things he had previously been too certain to understand, and the accumulation of all that belated understanding was its own specific kind of pain. Camille called him on the second week. She called from Paris, where she had gone after stepping down for her mental health, her message had said, which Grant did not doubt and did not hold against her in the way he might once have. "How are you?" she asked. "Operational," he said. "That's not what I asked." He thought about it. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest answer he had given anyone who'd asked him that question in years. "I genuinely don't know how I am. I know what needs to happen next, and I know what I need to do to make it happen, and past that I haven't—" He stopped. "I haven't gotten past that." "The hearing is next week," she said. "Yes." "Is there anything—" "No," he said, not unkindly. "There's nothing you can do, Camille. This is where I am, and it's where I have to be. I'll be okay. I mean that." She said goodbye with a gentleness that told him something about what she was feeling that he didn't have the emotional capacity to fully receive right now, and he let her go, and he sat with that too briefly before moving on to the next thing. The bankruptcy hearing was on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks and 1 day after the filing. The courtroom in the Southern District was exactly what Marcus had described: clean, spare, functional. Judge Carla Whitmore was 61 with short gray hair and the focused efficiency of someone who had been watching people try to manage catastrophe in her courtroom for 20 years and had long since stopped being surprised by the shapes it took. Grant sat at the primary table with Marcus and 3 of his associates. The room was more crowded than bankruptcy. Hearings typically are press. Financial analysts, several board members in the gallery, a contingent of creditors' attorneys arranged along the far table with the organized intensity of people who have been waiting for this specific morning and intend to make thorough use of it. Jonathan Graves was there. He sat at a separate table, not with the creditors' attorneys, not with the press, but in the specific position of a party who has a distinct and independent interest in the proceedings. He had 1 associate with him and a document portfolio that was, Grant noticed, considerably thicker than anything else on any table in the room. Vivian was not present. Grant had not expected her to be. She was in Geneva or somewhere else he did not know exactly where, which was itself a new experience, the not knowing the location of someone who had shared his life for 11 years. He found that he did not resent her absence. He would have had no idea what to do with her presence. Judge Whitmore opened at 9:02 a.m. and ran the room the way Marcus had said she would, without decoration, without tolerance for delay, with the sharp focus of someone who considers every minute of courtroom time a resource to be used accurately. The creditor's lead attorney, a woman named Susan Park, presented the debt acceleration argument with precision, and some relish the particular relish of someone who has a clean case and knows it. The acceleration clause was valid, the amount was documented, the lenders were entitled to call the debt. There was, she said, no credible path to restructuring given Sterling Vector's current asset position, and the uncertainty still hanging over its licensing infrastructure, even after the trust's confirmation. Marcus made his restructuring argument. It was a good argument, thoroughly prepared, honestly presented the best possible version of a difficult case. He outlined a reorganization plan, proposed a debt repayment schedule, argued for the value of the remaining operational assets. He spoke for 27 minutes. When he finished, Judge Whitmore looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Hale, the reorganization plan is premised on the continued viability of Sterling Vector's core technology platform. Am I correct?" "That's correct, Your Honor." "Mr. Graves," the judge said, turning, I understand you have a matter to raise regarding that technology platform. Jonathan Graves stood up. Grant looked at him. Marcus looked at him. The room looked at him. Thank you, Your Honor, Jonathan said. He was calm in the specific way that people are calm when they have been waiting a long time for a specific moment, and it has finally arrived. I'd like to introduce into evidence a provision from the original 2019 licensing agreement between Pacific Gateway Infrastructure, a wholly owned subsidiary of Ashbourne Global Infrastructure Trust, and Sterling Vector, LLC. Specifically, Exhibit 14, Clause 9.4c, the patent reversion provision. He placed the document on the evidence table. Judge Whitmore received it, read it again, looked up. Mr. Hale, she said, were you aware of this provision? Marcus stood. We became aware of it 29 days ago, Your Honor. We have been in consultation with opposing counsel. The provision stipulates, Judge Whitmore said not unkindly, but with the directness of someone who is going to say what is in the document, regardless of how anyone in the room feels about it, that upon the formal initiation of insolvency proceedings involving Sterling Vector, the core logistics AI patents listed in Appendix B, items 1 through 47, revert automatically and without compensation to the Ashbourne Global Infrastructure Trust. That is our reading as well, Your Honor, Jonathan said. Susan Park, the creditor's attorney, had gone very still. She was reading her own copy of the provision with the expression of someone who has just discovered a significant variable in a calculation she thought she had already completed. If the patents revert, she said, and her voice had a new quality in it. Not panic. She was too experienced for panic, but the focused recalibration of someone who is fast adapting to new information. Then the core asset value underpinning the restructuring plan is no longer part of Sterling Vector's estate, Jonathan said. Correct. The room absorbed that. Grant sat at his table and absorbed it too. He had known this was coming. Marcus had told him, and he had spent 29 days knowing it was coming, but knowing something is coming, and sitting in a courtroom while it arrives are two experiences that turn out to have very little in common. He had built those patents. Not alone, he had a team, a brilliant one, and he would be the first to say so, but he had funded them, driven them, made the decisions that had turned a logistics algorithm into the foundational IP of a $9 billion company. He had held those patents the way a person holds the thing they built that they are most proud of, not just as an asset, as evidence of what they were capable of, and they had never at the most fundamental level been his. Mr. Sterling, Judge Whitmore said. Grant looked up. I want to give you the opportunity to speak to the court, the judge said. Not through counsel, directly. Is there anything you'd like to say for the record regarding the current asset position and your company's ability to proceed with reorganization in light of this provision? Marcus put his hand briefly on Grant's arm, the protective gesture of a lawyer who knows that sometimes the best thing a client can do is not speak. Grant acknowledged it, and then he stood up anyway. He stood up because Richard Cho had told him to be honest, and he had learned in the past 30 days that honesty was not a strategy he had been born with, but was instead something you built through the specific discipline of doing it when it was hard. Your Honor, he said, Sterling Vector was built on technology that I believed we owned outright. I have learned in the past month that that belief was based on an incomplete understanding of the contractual architecture underlying our licensing agreements. He paused. He was not reading from notes. He had not prepared a statement. He was simply standing in a room and saying what was true. I made decisions about my company and about my personal life based on assumptions I never properly verified. The consequences of those assumptions are what this court is looking at right now. He stopped. I don't have a restructuring argument that survives the reversion of those patents. I think everyone in this room knows that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The room was very quiet. Judge Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Thank you, Mr. Sterling. You may be seated. She deliberated for 22 minutes. She did not leave the bench she sat with the documents read, made notes, read again, with the focused self-sufficiency of someone who has done this many times and trusts her own process. When she looked up, the room was ready. Sterling Vector's reorganization plan cannot be sustained in the absence of the core patent portfolio, she said. The reversion provision in Clause 9.4c is valid and enforceable and takes effect upon the filing of these insolvency proceedings. The patents are no longer part of the debtor's estate. She paused. The court therefore orders the liquidation of Sterling Vector LLC's remaining assets to be distributed to creditors in accordance with Chapter 7 priority rules. A trustee will be appointed by end of week. She said several more things after that: procedural instructions, timeline specifications, the particular administrative language of a court order that has just ended something. Grant heard them, he processed them, he stored them in the part of himself that would need to deal with them. But there was a moment inside all of that, a moment about 12 seconds long, between the judge saying liquidation and the judge saying trustee, when Grant Sterling sat in the courtroom where his company had just been ended and felt something he had not felt since he was 26 years old, and broke, and trying to get 11 people to believe in something that didn't exist yet. He felt the specific weightlessness of having nothing left to protect. It was terrible. And it was also in some way he would spend a long time trying to articulate something else, something that might eventually, with enough distance, be understood as the beginning of a different kind of freedom than the one he had been building toward for 20 years. Marcus was beside him, immediately professional and present, and doing the work of a good attorney. Paperwork was assembled. The courtroom began to move with the purposeful energy of proceedings that have reached their conclusion. Grant looked across the room. Jonathan Graves was gathering his documents with the same unhurried competence he always had. As if Grant had been watching him for a moment too long, Jonathan looked up. Their eyes met. Jonathan gave him a single nod. Not triumphant, not cold. The nod of a man who has completed a job he was given to do and is acknowledging the person on the other side of it with the respect that people who have been genuinely in the arena with each other sometimes exchange when it's over. Grant nodded back. Outside the courthouse, the press was waiting. 6 cameras, 12 reporters, the specific organized chaos of a media contingent that has been told something significant is happening and intends to document it. Marcus's team formed a practiced perimeter. Grant walked through without stopping, without statement, the practiced non-response of a man who has given the room what it was owed and has nothing more to give the cameras. In the car, Marcus sat beside him and said nothing for 3 full blocks. Then, "We'll appeal the patent reversion on procedural grounds. It's a long shot, but—" "No," Grant said. Marcus looked at him. "No appeal," Grant said. "It's over. I need to let it be over." Marcus studied him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, with the particular respect that comes from watching someone accept a thing that they could fight and choosing not to, because they understand that fighting it would be for their ego rather than for anything real. "Okay," Marcus said. Grant looked out the window. The city moved past in the specific way it does when you are moving through it without purpose for the first time in a very long time. Not toward a meeting, not toward a board call, not toward a next thing, just through. His phone had 46 notifications. He did not look at them. He thought about Vivian in Geneva. He thought about what she'd said on the phone. "I prepared for this because of who you became, not who you were." He thought about the 11 years and the gala and the seat card and the way she had watched him with that stillness that he now understood had never been acceptance. Had always been a woman who knew exactly who she was and was waiting to see if he would ever actually try to find out. He had not tried. And now he was sitting in a car with no company, no patents, no stock, and the very new and uncomfortable understanding that the most valuable thing that had ever been in his life was the person he had never properly seen. The car moved through the city. He let it. 6 months after the liquidation of Sterling Vector, the name Grant Sterling had become the kind of name that appears in business school case studies, not as a cautionary tale about fraud or malice, but as something more complicated and in some ways more instructive. A cautionary tale about assumption, about the specific danger of building an empire on a foundation you never once stopped to examine because you were too certain of your own centrality to consider that the foundation might belong to someone else. The case study did not yet exist when Grant was living inside the aftermath. It would take another 2 years for the academics to get there. In the meantime, he was simply a man who had lost everything he built and was learning, in the particular brutal school of that experience, what he was made of, when the thing he had always used to define himself was no longer there to define him. He did not disappear. That surprised some people who had predicted he would the type who assume that men built for winning have nothing left when the winning stops. Grant Sterling turned out to be more durable than that, though durable in a quieter register than anyone who had known him before would have predicted. He moved out of the Manhattan apartment 2 weeks after the hearing. He did not go far, a smaller place in Brooklyn, a floor through, in a building with no doorman and no spectacular view, the kind of apartment that is entirely about function and nothing about statement. He sold 3 of his 4 watches. He kept the one his father had given him when he turned 30, which was the only one that had never been about what it cost. Marcus Hale checked in monthly. Richard Cho called twice, the first time awkwardly, the second time more honestly, in the way that men who have known each other through institutions sometimes find a more genuine register when the institution is no longer between them. Paul Chen, the logistics director who had resigned and apologized for it, sent Grant a message on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 months after the liquidation, that simply said, "I'm starting something new. If you ever want to talk, I mean really talk, call me." Grant saved the message and did not call yet, but he did not delete it either, which was its own kind of forward motion. Camille he did not hear from again. He thought about her sometimes not with bitterness, not with the particular narrative rewriting that people do when they need a villain to organize the story of their own suffering. He thought about her the way you think about a choice you made that came from a real feeling, but was expressed in a way that cost too much. He wished her something that was not quite happiness and not quite luck, but somewhere between them. He thought that was probably the most honest thing he could offer. He had not spoken to Vivian since the night she called from whatever city she was in, and he was still in the apartment, trying to reassemble what he thought he knew about the world. That was 6 months ago. 6 months of silence between 2 people who had shared 11 years, which is its own particular mathematics, the ratio of silence to shared time so asymmetrical that it sits with you even when you are trying to think about something else. Eleanor Marsh called him. That surprised him most of all. She called on a Thursday afternoon, 74 days after the liquidation hearing, and she said, "Grant, it's Eleanor. Don't hang up." He had not been planning to hang up. "Eleanor," he said. "I'm calling on my own behalf," she said immediately, which told him she had anticipated his first question. "Not Vivian's. She doesn't know I'm calling. I want to be clear about that." "Okay," he said. "I've known you for 11 years, Eleanor said. "Not well. Vivian was always the connection. But enough." A pause. "I saw you in that courtroom. I was in the gallery. You didn't see me." He hadn't known. "Why were you there?" "Because I needed to see what you were going to do when you had nothing left to protect," Eleanor said. "People show you who they really are in rooms like that one. I wanted to see." "And," he said. "And," Eleanor said carefully, "I think you might have been a better man than you allowed yourself to be for a long time. I think the certainty got in the way. The momentum of being Grant Sterling got in the way of you actually being able to see anything that wasn't moving toward your next objective." She paused. "I'm not saying this to be cruel." "I know," he said. "She's building something," Eleanor said. "Something significant. I think you should know that. Not because it affects you, it doesn't not anymore, but because you spent 11 years next to a woman you didn't fully see, and I think part of your healing, if I can use that word without you wincing—" "You can use it," he said. "Part of your healing is understanding what was actually there," Eleanor said. "What you actually had. Not to mourn it in a way that keeps you stuck, but to understand it accurately so you can make different choices going forward." Grant sat with that for a moment. "What is she building?" he said. "She'll announce it herself," Eleanor said. "Soon, you'll see it." A pause. "How are you, Grant, actually?" He thought about what Vivian had said to Camille on the phone 6 months ago. "Ask me again in 6 months." He thought about honesty and how much he had learned to do it and how much he still had to learn. "I'm starting to understand some things," he said. "I don't know if that counts as good." "It counts," Eleanor said. "It absolutely counts." She said goodbye. He put the phone down and sat in the Brooklyn apartment in the particular quiet of a man who was being seen belatedly by people who had watched him not see himself for a long time. 3 weeks later, Vivian made her announcement. She did not do it quietly. She had never done things quietly. She had simply done them without announcing them, which is a different thing. But this, she announced. This, she put in front of the world with the full weight of the Ashbourne name and the full clarity of a woman who has arrived at a moment she has been building toward and has decided it deserves to be seen. Ashbourne Horizon. A global infrastructure and logistics platform, not a company exactly, and not a trust, but something between them. A hybrid entity that the financial press spent 3 days trying to categorize before mostly settling on unprecedented. It integrated AI-driven supply chain management, climate-adaptive infrastructure protocols, and a financial guarantee mechanism that allowed mid-sized logistics companies in developing markets to access Ashbourne's infrastructure at reduced cost. The 47 patents that had reverted from Sterling Vector's estate were its technological foundation re-engineered, expanded and integrated into a system that was by every technical assessment significantly more sophisticated than what Sterling Vector had ever deployed. The announcement event was held in Geneva, not a gala. Vivian had, it seemed, made a permanent decision about galas. It was a working conference, 400 people presentations, panels, the specific intellectual energy of a room where people have gathered because they genuinely want to understand something new rather than to be seen understanding it. Vivian spoke for 41 minutes. Eleanor watched from the third row. Jonathan Graves was near the back. Her brother Marcus Ashbourne, 48 years old, quiet, in the way that certain enormously powerful people are quiet, as if they have so much they don't need to prove, sat to her left. She spoke without notes, which she had always been able to do when the subject was something she knew completely. She talked about infrastructure, not abstractly, but specifically the way it actually works, and what it actually costs when it doesn't, the real human cost measured in delayed medical shipments and food supply disruptions, and the particular economic fragility of communities that depend on systems owned by people who have never visited them. She talked about the Ashbourne family's 70-year history of infrastructure investment and what it had taught her about the difference between building something to own it and building something to sustain it. She talked about Ashbourne Horizon's first 12 partners, which were drawn from 11 countries and represented a collective logistics infrastructure serving 400 million people. And then she said the sentence that ended up in every piece of coverage that got quoted in the Financial Journal and the Times and 11 international equivalents that became in a very short time the thing people cited when they talked about Vivian Ashbourne. Loyalty without dignity is not love, it is erasure. And a woman who has been erased is not gone. She is waiting. She is learning. And when she is ready, she builds something that cannot be ignored. The room was silent for a beat. Then it was not silent at all. Eleanor cried, which she would deny to most people, and admit to Vivian later that same night over wine in a hotel room when it was just the two of them, and the pretense of composure was no longer necessary. "You were magnificent," Eleanor said. "I was accurate," Vivian said, "which is the only kind of magnificent I know how to be." Eleanor laughed. Then she said, "Grant watched the live stream." Vivian stilled slightly, set down her wine glass, looked at Eleanor with the measured attention she brought to information that required her full presence. "You talked to him." 3 weeks ago, Eleanor said. "I told you I was calling on my own behalf." "You did tell me that," Vivian agreed. She picked her glass back up, took a sip. "How was he?" "Starting to understand things," Eleanor said. "His words." Vivian looked at the middle distance for a moment, in the way she looked at things when she was allowing herself to feel them rather than analyze them, a practice she had been getting better at in the 6 months since Geneva became her primary residence, feeling things without immediately converting them to strategy. It was harder than it looked. "Good," she said, quietly, and she meant it. "Do you want to see him?" Eleanor asked, directly, because Eleanor was incapable of being indirect about things she considered important. Vivian thought about it honestly, which is to say, she thought about it without arriving at the answer she thought she was supposed to have. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the gala and the conference room and the phone call and the courtroom she had not attended because attending would have been about something other than what was right. She thought about the man she had married at 32, who had been in the beginning something real and good, before momentum and certainty had built up around him like a shell he stopped being able to see past. "No," she said. "Not now. Maybe not ever. That's not where my energy belongs anymore." She paused. "But I hope he's okay. I mean that." "I know you do," Eleanor said. What happened over the following months was reported in the financial press as a business story because the financial press has a limited vocabulary for things that are also human stories. The business story was this: Ashbourne Horizon launched its first operational network in April, connecting 14 logistics partners across East Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America. It processed its first $1 billion in coordinated supply chain transactions by June. By August, it had been named by 3 separate infrastructure analysts as the most significant new entrant to the global logistics space in a decade. The human story was different and was not reported anywhere because human stories rarely are. The human story was Vivian Ashbourne sitting in her office in Geneva on a Wednesday morning in May, reading the first operational report from the East African Network, a report that included a line she had specifically asked to be included, a metric her team had initially considered irrelevant: the number of female-owned logistics businesses that had accessed the Ashbourne Horizon infrastructure guarantee in the first 30 days. The number was 43. 43 women who had been told by banks and by investors, and by the specific accumulated weight of systems not built for them, that they were too small, too uncertain, too much of a risk, who had now, through the Ashbourne Horizon guarantee mechanism, accessed the infrastructure that made them viable. She read that line, read it again, and felt something in her chest that was warm and definite and did not require any analysis at all. She had started the foundation 2 months before the Horizon launch. Eleanor had helped her structure it. Jonathan had helped with the legal architecture. She had named it quietly, without press, without announcement, the Vivian Ashbourne Foundation for Economic Independence. Its first program provided emergency financial and legal support for women in marriages or relationships characterized by economic control. Women who had been made to feel that their safety and their survival depended on staying in something that was diminishing them because leaving seemed financially impossible. She knew what that felt like. She had been insulated from it by the Ashbourne name and the resources she had not used for 11 years, precisely because she had been determined to stand on her own within the marriage she had chosen. But she knew what it felt like to be offered $10 million to disappear by a man who believed that was all you were worth. She knew what it felt like to be seated at table 12. And she had decided, with the same clarity and patience she brought to everything, that knowing what something felt like meant you had a specific obligation to the people who were living it without the resources to navigate their way out. The foundation's first-year budget was $40 million. She funded it entirely herself, which prompted Eleanor to say, "You know, most people start foundations with smaller numbers than the settlement they just received." And Vivian said, "I know." And Eleanor said, "Okay, just checking." And that was that. Grant Sterling watched the Ashbourne Horizon launch from his Brooklyn apartment on the live stream, as Eleanor had told Vivian. He watched all 41 minutes of it. He watched the part where she said, "Loyalty without dignity is not love." And he sat with that sentence the way he had learned in the past 6 months to sit with things. He called Paul Chen the next morning, the logistics director who had left, and apologized and offered to talk. He called him at 8 a.m., and Paul picked up on the third ring and said "Grant" in the voice of someone who had been wondering when this call would come. "You said you were starting something new," Grant said. "I am," Paul said. "Early stage. We're looking at AI-assisted last-mile logistics for emerging markets, 5 of us right now. It's..." A brief pause, the pause of someone who is working on something they believe in and is slightly cautious about how much of that belief to show it's the right kind of hard, if that makes sense. "It makes sense," Grant said. "I spent 20 years doing the wrong kind of hard. I understand the difference now." Paul was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you looking for something to do, or are you asking me to lunch?" "Both," Grant said. "I'd like to understand what you're building. I have some knowledge that might be useful, and I have I have a lot of time right now, and I've been thinking about what I want to do with it, and I think the answer is something smaller and more honest than what I've been doing, something I can see all the way to the foundation of." Paul laughed, a real one, surprised and warm. "Get on the subway and come to Brooklyn," he said. "We're on Atlantic Avenue. I'll buy you coffee." "I'm already in Brooklyn," Grant said. Another laugh. "Of course you are. Come now then." Grant put on his jacket, the one without the subtle executive tailoring, the one he'd bought 3 months ago at a regular store because he was relearning the habit of buying things for what they were rather than what they communicated. He picked up his keys, his phone, looked at the apartment that had no view and no statement to make and was beginning gradually to feel like a place where a person actually lived. He walked out the door. The city received him the way it always had, indifferently, efficiently, with no adjustment made for his history or his losses. He took the subway 2 stops, which was something he had not done in 15 years, and which turned out to be exactly the same as he remembered, which was somehow comforting. He thought about Vivian's speech. He thought about the sentence, "She builds something that cannot be ignored," and he thought about the 43 patents that had been his and were now hers, and were now the foundation of something that was by every honest measure better than what he had built with them. He thought about whether that was supposed to hurt more than it did. It hurt. But underneath the hurt was something else, something that was not yet peace, but might, with enough time and enough honest work, become it. He was 47 years old. He had built one empire by moving fast and certain and never questioning the ground beneath him. He had time if he was careful and honest and genuinely willing to be a different kind of man than the one who had put his wife at table 12 to build something worth standing on. Not 9 billion, not for the market, not for the cover of Forbes. Something small enough to see and real enough to trust. He got off the subway, found the address on Atlantic Avenue. Paul was outside, coffee in hand, looking like a man who is exactly where he has chosen to be. He saw Grant and raised the coffee cup in a small acknowledgement, not warm exactly, not yet, but open, the beginning of something. "You look different," Paul said. "I am different," Grant said. Paul studied him for a moment. "You sure about that? Or is it just the jacket?" Grant almost smiled. "Give me 6 months," he said. "I'll prove it." 6 months, Paul said. He held the door open. "Come in, we have a lot to talk about." Grant walked in. Back in Geneva, Vivian Ashbourne was on a call with her Horizon Operations Director, reviewing the September network expansion plans, when her assistant knocked and held up a phone screen through the glass. A news alert. She held up one finger 1 minute and wrapped the operations call, then took the phone. The alert was from a financial journal. The headline read, "Ashbourne Horizon Q 2 numbers exceed all projections. Is this the new architecture of global logistics?" She read the first paragraph, set the phone down, looked out at the city she had made her home. Her own phone buzzed. A text from her brother Marcus. "Congratulations, little sister, you did it." She typed back, "We did it, all of us." He replied with a single image, the Ashbourne family crest, old formal, the kind of thing that had been on documents and buildings for 70 years. Followed by "Dad would have been proud." She held the phone for a moment, put it down, took a breath. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up the foundation's intake report for the week, and got back to work. Because this was what she had always known, and what 11 years of being underestimated had only confirmed: the building never stops. You do not arrive at the destination and stop moving. You build and you build and you build, and you make sure what you build is real, and you make sure it belongs to the people it should belong to, and you make sure the foundation, the actual foundation, not the surface, not the part that looks solid from a distance, but the thing underneath everything else, you make sure that foundation has the right name on it. Hers did. It always had. Vivian Ashbourne did not destroy Grant Sterling. She simply stopped holding up the parts of him that were never hers to carry, and what fell was only what had never truly been built to stand.